Well, the end of September was pretty exhausting. Let's see what October brings. Hello, welcome to Reading from Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. So today is my wrap up for the month of September. I'm going to go over the books I read in the latter half of September, as well as what I'm reading now, what is on my TBR for the beginning of October, and then I'll also talk about some of the reviews that are going to be coming up on the channel over the next 2 weeks, and then a little bit of ramble about style and presentation at the end. To begin with, what did I read for the second half of September? Well, the first book I finished, one of the ones I had been reading in my last check-in, and that's The Bloodstained Doll by John Everson. And I have to say, I did not love this story. This was an homage to the 1960s and 70s Giallo films, and it felt like he was more concerned with paying homage to those films than he was with actually having a good story or plot. I suppose that sounds a little harsh, but that's kind of how I felt reading it. And it has everything you want if you're looking for a 1960s or 70s Giallo film. You know, it has the main protagonist has relocated to a new place, so she's an outsider, and there is a killer who wears a mask and has black leather gloves, and there are some bloody, gruesome deaths, and there is some, unnecessary sexual violence. It felt far more concerned with putting in all those markers than having a story that really cohered in a logical way, and that was fun to read to me. The heart of the story is a young girl, 17. She is a senior in high school, living in London with her mom. Her mom dies in a freak car accident, so she has to go to Germany to live with her uncle. He works for the government, and he's in a big mansion. So she goes to live with him, and there is a giant storm, a rainstorm, and a tree is toppled over, and they find a coffin at the bottom of the tree, but the coffin is empty, and all of a sudden people start dying. And everyone that dies, there is like a doll, a ceramic doll that's left to this corpse. And you have to figure out what is going on, if she is next on the victim list and so on. And that's fine. Like, that's a decent enough idea for a story. But everything was just so ham-fisted, there was no subtlety about it. It was clear what it was trying to pay homage to, but it didn't have anything interesting to say. It didn't have anything interesting to add. You could guess what was happening pretty early on. It didn't really have any surprises for me. And I realized it's sometimes small, weird things that can put me off a whole story. But so, for instance, in this story, so the young woman is from England, and the whole story takes place in Germany. And she mentions in the beginning that she knows some conversational German, but she can't read it because she was in a library thinking if there are any books that she could read. But the whole story is written in basically American English, and everyone speaks to her without any problem. Whether it be the servants at the mansion, the cook, the cleaner, the helpers, any store she goes to, any administrative assistant, any waitress, even people she meets on the street randomly, there's no communication problems with anyone. And it's written in American English. So I kind of just assumed that they were really speaking German, and it was like dubbed or translated for the audience. And even that is weird. It just felt weird that they were all speaking in American English, but you can kind of overlook it. But then she meets one character who only speaks German to her, and she doesn't know what he's saying, and it has to be translated for her. So that means everyone else in this story just speaks English, and they all speak American English, even though, most of them are German, and she is British. And it was just enough to really make me frustrated with the story, because it's a kind of simple detail that it's easy to fix, and this is a well-known author. He's written a number of books, so either an editor or early readers should have caught it. And maybe I'm the only one who bothered. Maybe they did catch it and no one cared. But for me, that little detail kind of soured me on the whole stories. So even though it had like these fun trappings of Giallo, it really felt like it cared more about being a Giallo than it did about having a good story. And what story it did have just felt disjointed. It felt very predictable. And put all that on top of the fact that I had this like frustration with the language itself in the story. It was not a win for me. That's okay. They can't all be winners. And I still, got something out of it. And reading it did make me think it brought up a number of things, both analyzing about how I think about what's going on in the story, but also about how I appreciate and engage in different writing styles. So, there's no losses here, but it wasn't the best of stories. Moving on, the next story I finished is a novella. This is called Errant Roots by Sonora Taylor. And this I liked quite a lot. This I thought was fun. It was very short, less than 100 pages. It had to do with family and about family that you may have left behind. The main character is a woman who is young and she's pregnant. And when her mother finds out she's pregnant, the two of them have to go back to her mother's kind of ancestral home where she hasn't been for the last 2.5 decades. And the young woman doesn't know anything about her mother's family. And when you get there, you find out there may be some kind of weird occultish / ritual things going on. And so it's got these little spooky vibes, kind of folk horror vibes. And I thought it was fun. It was good. I'll have a review a little later on the channel, closer to the publication date of that story. Next was one of the books I was looking to all month, and that is Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the 4th book in his Southern Reach trilogy, and I loved this story. I thought it was great. I loved the original trilogy. I have a review of the whole trilogy on my channel. You can check it out. And I was satisfied with that trilogy and with what answers it gave us and with what things it didn't answer. So there's no need for me to go back to Area X. I was happy with what we were given, but now a decade later, he decided to go back, and I'm glad he did. He continued with using a different narrative style and doing something different than he'd done in the previous 3 books. And really, I thought it was a blast. I had a really good time with it, and I'll have a review coming up, I think in the second half of October, closer to the publication date. So the next book I finished in the second half of the month was not an arc. This was The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I'd mentioned I wanted to read the Farseer trilogy, or at least start with the Farseer trilogy as part of her Realm of the Elderlings series. The whole series has 16 books, but it's a number of different trilogies put together. So the Farseer trilogy is the first one, and the first book is The Assassin's Apprentice, and I had a great time with this. I really, really liked it. Some of the complaints you might see about it are that it is slow, and it is slow moving, and it is slow moving the way it's paced out, but I didn't want to leave the world. I was so happy in the world she created with the characters that she gave us that I didn't mind it being slow because things were happening. You weren't like beating your head against the wall because nothing was going on. It just wasn't full of action and fight scenes every other page. And so things were slowly moving, but I was so enraptured in the world that I didn't mind that they were slow. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to continuing in the series. So that was The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. The next book I finished was another arc. This was The Queen by Nick Cutter. So many people know Nick Cutter for The Troop. That's one of his more famous novels. So this is a new one, and I enjoyed this. I read The Troop quite a while ago, and I enjoyed it. So I can't really compare this one to that. This is kind of a coming-of-age body horror story. A young woman is the protagonist, and in the opening scene, which is set in media res, she is trapped in a kitchen, and there are other people outside of the kitchen that are all dead or dying, but then there are things crawling out of their dead bodies, or their dead bodies are being kind of puppeted or used to incubate larvae of some sort. And her best friend is sitting on a throne and has transformed into this kind of insectoid monster. And that is how the story starts, and then it goes back a day. And then the whole story takes place over the course of the day before those events, and her trying to find her friend, getting cryptic messages from her friend, and things kind of unraveling from there. I enjoyed the story. I thought the narrative device, the framing, wasn't necessary. And I go more into that in my review, which will come up later in the month, closer to the publication date. It was framed almost like a scavenger hunt. And her friend would send her a message, and she'd go to one place and then get a new message and move along. And it just didn't seem necessary for the story. However, the writing was good, the pacing was good, the overall imagery in the story I thought was fun. There was an antagonist, and his motivations felt a little kind of sloppy and not very interesting, very simplistic, but he still served as a good villain. And so everything came together really well. I had a fun time reading it. There's some really gruesome, goopy kind of body horror stuff going on, so that's always fun. So I do recommend it, and I have a review coming up a little later. And then I finished my short story anthology. This is the only one I finished this month, which is strange. Usually I read 2 or 3 a month, but this one is called Revelations, Horror Writers for Climate Change. And I thought this was actually great. It took me a while to warm up to it. And part of the reason was the first few stories didn't really feel like they had a whole lot to do with ecology or the climate or the world. And to be fair, this collection was all work that had been previously published. And the editor, Sean O'Connor, kind of curated this collection. And a percentage of the profits are going to Climate Outreach, which is a group to help prevent climate change and raise awareness. And so that's great. But hypothetically, all the stories had some sort of through line to do with climate or something like that. And as the anthology continued, it became more cohesive, and many of the stories were set in a climate apocalypse, a near future climate apocalypse. That was a common theme. Others were just set in the woods, the story. There's a story by Clive Barker, and that was set in a magical, almost fairy woods where, a dark forest kind of thing. And so some of them, the connection to ecology or the climate climate change kind of disaster was a little bit tenuous, but others were really firm in their connection to that theme. And overall, I liked almost all the stories. I had a really great time with them. I thought John Langan's and Sarah Langan's stories were quite great. Laird Barron's story was really nice. Clive Barker was great. Joe Hill had 2 stories in it. One was only a page long, and one was a page and a half long. And I thought they were both really good. The page and a half one was like so sardonic and funny. It made me laugh out loud. The last line it was really, really funny. Stephen King had a story in it. It was a story that was published in The Bazaar of Bad Dreams. So I'd read that story before. The others I hadn't read. Overall, I thought it was a really good collection. I highly recommend picking it up. A portion of the profits do go to a good cause, but even aside from that, it's just a fun collection to have on your shelves. Now, I will say I read the paperback of this. It was previously published in hardcover edition, and I think a different press did the publishing of the hardcover versus the paperback. I'm not quite sure. But the paperback, I will say there were some errors. There were some mistakes in it. Like the title, the header for 2 of the books was incorrect, and there were a few typos here and there, and there was none of it was distracting. Like it wasn't, it didn't interfere with my pleasure reading the story, but it was put out by Dead Sky Publishing, which is an indie publisher, a small publisher, but they do a lot of work, and I've read a lot of stuff by them because they're the ones that publish the Splatter Western series that I've been reading. And they also publish some of the more kind of gory or extreme horror books, So I've read a number of things by them, and this is the first time I've been a little bit disappointed just with the quality of the output of the book itself. There were a few of these kind of small mistakes that you would expect maybe in an independently published book, but not with something from a publishing house, even a small independent publishing house. So that was a little disappointing, but none of them were egregious. None of them got in the way of my reading of the story, but they did stand out. Like I did notice them, for better or worse, And then 2 more books rounding out the month. The next one is called Feast While You Can. This is by Michaela Clements and Anjali Datta. So this story follows a young woman who is queer. She lives in a small mountain town in Europe, I think in Italy. It doesn't ever give the exact location, but that's where all the signs point to. And an ancient evil kind of awakes that latches onto her, and they can't figure out how to break this curse. And the only thing that seems to help break the curse is another woman who had previously dated her boyfriend, but then also came out as a lesbian and now lives in the big city, is back home because her father died and she's cleaning out his house. And something about her is repelling this evil entity, this ancient evil entity that's latched on to our main character. And so they are trying to understand what this entity is and how to get rid of it and why is it latching onto one person and not another, and so forth and so on. And, I really enjoyed this story. It has a lot of things to say about belonging. Both of these young women are not only are they both queer, but they're also both biracial. And the way they're treated by the townfolk is wildly different because our main character's family is very popular and well known and respected in the town, where the other girl's family isn't. So these things that she can get away with, she has this social privilege that the other girl was never given. So the other girl was always bullied and picked on, and she hates that town. She doesn't ever want to be there. Where our main character loves it, even though it's small and rustic and backwards, and doesn't want to leave it. You'd think the 2 of them had had the exact same experience because they share so many things and they're so different than the other townsfolk in the same ways. And yet, because of other complicating factors, their experiences are wildly different. So the story is looking at these ideas about what it means to come home again, obviously, but also about inclusion and identity and what are the bits and pieces of our social experience that make up our identity and how does that affect how we live in the world and how we affect others. So I thought it was really, really interesting. It didn't give any clean answers, especially as our main character. You would expect her to be more sympathetic, but there are things she does where she has this level of social privilege that she has never really thought about until she gets called out on it. And so to have your main character, who is, a really likable character and really well drawn and really compelling, then called out for her mistakes is a really fun kind of plot twist and a narrative device. So this was a lot of fun. And I do have a longer review of this coming out again, closer to its publication date. And then the last title that I finished for the month was another arc. So there was a lot of arcs in the second half of this month. And this one is called Interstellar Mega Chef. And this is by Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan. And, I thought this would be fun. It's kind of a queer sci-fi, somewhat cozy comedy. And I thought it'd be a nice way to end out the month before jumping into spooky season. Unfortunately, this also did not do a lot for me. I was excited to read it. It's written by an Indian author. I like the premise. The story takes place about 2,600 years in the future. The timeline is 600 years in the future, humans established the first interstellar travel on a planet called Primus. And then from there, they spread out to a number of other planets and colonies and eventually meet other races they call alt beings, essentially aliens. And so our story takes place 2,000 years after that. So 2,600 years in the future from now. The whole story takes place on Primus, that first planet that Earthlings colonized. And the story is that a young woman from Earth is escaping Earth, and you don't know why. You know that there's something happened in her past that gets alluded to right in the beginning, and she is traveling on a refugee visa. And you find out the kind of mystery of her past about 25% of the way into the story. But she's traveling to Primus to escape whatever it is she's running away from, but also to compete in basically a Master Chef type cooking competition because she was an expert chef on Earth. And so she is trying to compete in this competition. That's the setup for the story. Though that only goes for about 25% of the story, to be honest, because then you continue from there. The other main character you follow is a woman who is born on Primus, and she works creating Sims, so augmented reality Sims. And she has this idea to create a Sim about food and about the experiences you have while eating food and the memories and all these things that accompany eating a good meal. And so, she and our other main character meet by accident and they clash, but then they come together and then they work together. And that is the idea of the story, right? It's how they are kind of repellent personalities, but they all are working together for one reason or another. I like the idea overall. I thought the pacing was good, moving back and forth between a few different characters' point of view. It did pull you along the whole time. It didn't really ever stall, but everything just felt so overwrought, And it felt like she was trying to make a comment, like the whole planet of Primus and the main city of Uru, it was supposed to be like a satire where they supposedly hold themselves to the highest of ideals. They consider themselves the most evolved of human beings, and they have these high ideals of inclusivity, and they fight xenophobia and all of these any of the isms they're openly against, and they have these high ideals of how evolved they are, but they're all hypocrites and they're all liars. And so you'd think that the book is kind of looking at virtue signaling and criticizing that, and that's the point of its satire. But then you look at the Earthlings, who are all kind of characterized as barbaric and as warmongers, and they kind of are, and they're also awful. And all the things that are said about them in hurtful and offensive ways is actually kind of true from what you're told. So it's hard to see where the satire is pointing because she is kind of taking down everyone in this story. And so it feels like it's spread out too far. And because it's spread so far, nothing really sticks. Everything just feels overwrought. And then the world itself, I don't know, making a sci-fi world that is 2,600 years in our future, but has some sort of basis in Earth civilization, I can appreciate it's hard in trying to know what new things you're going to invent whole cloth versus what you're going to have adapted from contemporary society. Like, it's difficult. I get it. But I don't know, just the world building felt really forced. And you could see the seams, kind of. Do you know what I mean? Like, it didn't feel organic, it didn't feel natural. And the whole time, you are very aware that this is this invented world that's trying very hard to do something. And it never felt like it was quite succeeding in the ways it was trying for all the effort that was going into it. So I didn't love this story, unfortunately. I liked the characters. I thought they were interesting. Even some of the ancillary characters are quite interesting. There are a few aliens that you meet, different alien species. And, I thought that balance was fun. The main characters were really defined by one thing. They were rounded and they had interesting personalities. But our main character, who's the chef, was defined by how stubborn she is and how, she had to prove herself in one way or another. And then the other young woman who is the programmer, the engineer, is also similarly defined by one thing and about, how much success she's able to accumulate. And it doesn't matter what she burns down to become successful and to be recognized as the best in her field. And so their characters, while they felt rounded, they also felt stunted in some way because they were so focused on this one character trait that kind of propelled them through the whole narrative. If you like somewhat cozy queer sci-fi that takes place in the distant future and has to do with food, and is very heavily biased to Desi population, to Indian ideas. There's a lot of Sanskrit terms or terms that you see very closely coming from Sanskrit. It's definitely not centered in a white gaze. So, brown people are kind of at the center of this new universe. If that is appealing to you, then it was a fun story and I enjoyed it. There's going to be sequels. It ends without resolving everything. And it even says part 1 of the such and such series. So there will be more. I don't know if I'm invested enough to read future installments of the series, but I can see that there's an audience for it. So it may be something that you'd enjoy. It just didn't quite do it for me. Okay, and those were the 8 books that I finished in the second half of September. So what am I reading right now? Right now I'm reading 2 books. One of them, again, is an arc, and this is called We Shall Be Monsters by Alyssa Wees. And I just started this morning, so I don't know a lot about it, but it has witchy vibes. A young woman who is marked for death going into a cursed forest to save her mother. So there's a lot of mother-daughter kind of relationship stuff going on. At least it's what is promised by the blurb on the back of the book. And so I haven't really gotten into it yet. I literally just opened it today. So that's what I'm reading right now. as a novel. And then I also have another short story collection. And right now I'm reading The Best Horror of the Year, Volume 15, edited by Ellen Datlow. That is this one. So this is the best horror that was published in 2022. The next volume of this, volume 16, with horror published in 2023, that's coming out later this year, I think. This one was just published in January. And so far I'm 5 stories in, I think, and I think it's great. Again, this is not an anthology that people wrote for. It was Ellen Datlow finding what she found to be the best horror and curating this collection. And so far, it's a bunch of heavy hitters and really, really fun stories. 2 of the stories in it I've already read before from different anthologies, but the rest of them are all new to me, so I'm excited to keep reading this as we go into spooky season. This to always have kind of horror short stories going on in the background is the plan. So that's what I'm starting right now. So those are the 2 books I'm reading right now. So now looking forward into the first 2 weeks of October, it is spooky season and I would love to be reading more spooky books, but I do have a number of arcs that are going to be due in November. So I'm going to start with those to try to get those out of the way. And hopefully I can continue these kind of horror short story collections. And that will be my fill for horror for the month if I don't get to any novels. And then we'll see what it goes. The first book I know I want to read soon is the sequel to Assassin's Apprentice. So this is Royal Assassin. So this is the second book in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. So that's a fantasy book, not horror, but I had a great time with the first book in the series. So I hope to continue this trilogy, and I'll finish the second book this month in October. And then the third book I will read in November, at least that's the plan. So I do have 2 other, I have short story collections for days. I have so many of them, but there are 2 brand newly published ones that I'm hoping to read this month as my kind of horror spooky season reads if I can't get to any novels. So the first one is called Fear, Tales of Psychological Horror, and this is an anthology edited by Ellen Datlow. And the next one is called Not a Speck of Light by Laird Barron. And these are both just published this last month, I think. I've already ordered them. I don't have my copies yet. The Laird Barron one, I've read a number of his short stories and really enjoyed them. And I heard him speaking on a podcast, on the Talking Scared podcast, which is a podcast where he interviews horror authors. And I really liked what he had to say, and his new collection sounds really interesting and exciting. So I'm excited to pick that up. And, I've never read a collection edited by Ellen Datlow that I haven't enjoyed. So those are the 2 other short story anthologies that I'm looking forward to when I finish this one. And then the next 3 titles that I hope to finish in the first half of the month are, again, all arcs that I received. One of them is a horror story, and that one is called Sundown in Sant Ojuelo by M.M. Olivas. And so I can just read the jacket copy for this because I haven't started reading it yet. But the jacket copy says, "The night is hungry and your soul is worn thin. When her favorite aunt's death calls Liz Remolina back to the desert town of Sant Ojuela, the prospect fills her with dread. Her memories of the place are marred by tragedy. Yet the return to her childhood home also means a chance to make peace with a dark history. Liz expects to meet ghosts in Sant Ojuela. She's not prepared for the terrifying ancient gods who stalk its desolate landscape. Teaming up with her childhood best friend Julian may be the only hope as the darkness closes in, even though he's not exactly the Julian she remembers." So that sounds fun. I like going home, right? Stories about going home, I think, are always exciting. They always have a lot of rich ideas to play with. For me, desert landscapes don't really scream spooky season, but anything with terrifying ancient gods is always, good for me. So that is one of the arcs I'm going to be reading. Then the other 2 that I hope to finish in the first half of the month. The first one is by Martha Wells, and this is Wheel of the Infinite. Now, this was originally published in 2000, but this is a new and revised edition that's being published in October, or rather in November, excuse me. And I haven't read the original, so I don't know, and it's not clear like if there's a lot changed or not, so I'm not sure. I know I've read Martha Wells' sci-fi stuff, specifically her Murderbot books, and I've really enjoyed those. I haven't read her fantasy stuff, and this is a high fantasy, so we'll see how it goes. The copy says, "A traitor and a swordsman join forces to save the world from being rewritten into devastation. Every year, the image of the Wheel of the Infinite must be painstakingly remade to ensure another year of peace and harmony for the Celestial Empire. Every 100 years, the very fabric of the world must be rewoven. Linked by the mystic energies of the infinite, the wheel and the world are one. But a black storm is spreading across the wheel, reappearing each morning bigger and darker than before, unraveling the beautiful and orderly patterns. Maskel, a murderer and a traitor, has been summoned back to help put the world right with the assistance of the mysterious Rian, a swordsman of some renown. If they can't find the source of the problems that plague the wheel, the world may find its latest rotation is its last." So with that in mind, I'm very open-minded and I like fantasy books in general, and I like Martha Wells, so I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully it will be fun. And then the last arc that I hope to finish in the first half of October is another fantasy, and this is called The Last Hour Between Worlds by Melissa Caruso. And the Jacket copy for this one says, "In the deep echoes, no one can save you. Star investigator Kimbrel Thorne has a few hours away from her newborn, and she just wants to relax and enjoy the year-turning party. But when people start dropping dead, she's got to get to work, especially when she finds that mysterious forces are plunging the whole party down through layers of reality and into nightmare. 1 layer down, it's no big deal. Stay alert, you'll be fine. 2, 3 layers down, natural laws are negotiable, and things get very strange. 4 layers down, there are creatures with eyes in their teeth and walls that drip blood. Most people who fall this far never return. Luckily, Cam isn't most people. But as cosmic powers align and the hour grows late, she'll have to work with her awfully compelling nemesis, notorious cat burglar Rika Nonsuch, for a chance to save her city, though not her night off." So this is marketed as a fantasy, but it sounds like it's infused with some cosmic horror, so that's exciting. And I'm actually looking forward to reading that quite a lot. So those 6 books are the books that I hope to finish through the first half of October. So hopefully I'll get through all those in the first 2 weeks. We'll see. My September was quite busy because in the end of September, I had exams here at the monastery. We had our first 2 exams of the year. And so it was very stressful preparing for those and studying for those. They always just kind of occupy a lot of mental space. And so September was quite busy in that way. We have 2 more exams, arguably more important exams, and those are going to be in November. So October is going to be really a month of reviewing. Myself and my classmates. We still have class to go to and things like this, but it's a little more laid back because the month really is dedicated to review and prepare for the very stressful exams we have coming up in November. So hopefully October will be a little bit more laid back than the end of my September was. And so I don't think having those 6 books as my TBR is unrealistic. Hopefully I can actually read a few more than that, but those are the only ones that I'm planning on. And if I get through those 6, we'll see what comes up next. I don't have any plans or anything specific in mind. I'm going to do some mood reading. Now, what is coming up on the channel? So in the next 2 weeks, I have 5 reviews. One is for a book called Tales Accursed by Richard Wells, and this is a collection of classic folk horror. I thought this was a lot of fun. I think the oldest story in this collection goes back to the mid-1800s, and the newest story is from the 1960s, I think. So it's all quite classic folk horror, and it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Next is going to be a review of a new book called The Black Hunger by Nicholas Pullen, and this is a queer gothic horror novel set in 19th century England that has to do with a nihilistic Buddhist death cult. So I enjoyed it. I thought it had some problems with the way it portrayed Buddhism, so to speak. And I talk about that in my review. But overall, I thought this tender queer love story at the heart of this terrifying gothic story that has world-ending stakes was really beautiful. And the way the larger story wrapped around this queer romance I thought was really, really touching. So that's coming up soon. So both of those are coming up this week. And then the week after that, there'll be 3 reviews instead of 2. The first one will be You Will Speak for the Dead by R.A. Busby. This is a short novella about a young man whose life is kind of in shambles, and he works to clean out houses, from hoarders, houses that are abandoned by hoarders. And on one of his jobs, he finds something in a house that kind of reshapes his experience of reality. So I kind of think of this as almost a cozy body horror, which sounds contradictory, but it makes sense if you read it. And so I talk about more about that in my review. The next review will be for Strange Beasts by Susan J. Morris, and I thought this was great. This is a gothic occult detective story, perfect for Occult Detective October. It combines the Dracula universe and the Sherlock Holmes universe, following Sam Harkers, who is the daughter of Jonathan Harkers, who killed Dracula, along with Helena Moriarty, who is the daughter of James Moriarty, who killed Sherlock Holmes. And the 2 of them have to work together to fight against a supernatural beast. They work for an institution or an organization that fights off supernatural threats. And Sam is traditionally a researcher, so she doesn't get out into the field. This is her first job out in the field. And Helena doesn't do well with other partners because no one trusts her and no one likes her. And her last 3 partners died due to mysterious circumstances. And so the 2 of them have to team up. And it's kind of cozy. The stakes are high in that there are, a few bloody deaths and their lives are in danger throughout the book, but it still has this kind of cozy, really friendly feel. And I thought it was quite a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing continued adventures in this universe if she were to write them. So that's Strange Beasts by Susan J. Morris. A review of that is coming up. And then lastly, a review of Errant Roots, the novella I mentioned at the top by Sonora Taylor. That is also going to be coming up in about 2 weeks' time. So those are the reviews I have coming up in the next 2 weeks. And also next Monday, there'll be a video that is kind of me thinking about representation in fiction, and specifically queer representation, and what is kind of the distinguishing line that demarcates queer inclusion and queer erasure. Because sometimes I think those two things actually get a little fuzzy. And so I talk about that. That's going to be coming up on Monday. So that's what's coming up on the channel. And lastly, just the last thing I wanted to talk about today was just a little bit of a ramble. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I've been thinking about style. And I've been thinking about the way stories are presented. And what got me thinking about it is reading Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. And this was published in 1995. And Game of Thrones was published in 1996. And if you take a bird's eye view, these two novels have a lot of similarities. They both take place in like an approximation of a medieval European kind of area. They both are focused on political intrigue and have a number of different factions and a number of different people vying for power in different areas, whether it be like internal coups or whether it be other centers of power that are competing for power. They both live in a world where magic exists to some degree, but not everyone has control over it. There's only a few people that have access to it. They both have as one of their main characters, or their main character, a young bastard who was born actually to do great things, but is kind of held back from those great things due to his birthright and to people around him that want power for themselves. And so in this way, from the outside, they look like they have a lot of similarities, but the way the stories are told is remarkably different. And that is what sets them apart, I think, in many ways. You know, all of the Song of Ice and Fire books, every chapter is told from a new person's point of view. And so you get characters from these different competing factions, and you go from chapter to chapter to see different people's point of view. And as a result, the story really does, all of the Song of Ice and Fire books are really propulsive, you know, because you jump around so often that there's a type of energy that Martin is able to kind of harness and keep, even though they have very hefty page counts, right? So Game of Thrones is around 800 pages, whereas Assassin's Apprentice is only around 450 pages, maybe a little less. So even with that big page count, you have this kind of energy, and no one ever accuses those books of being slow. Yet Assassin's Apprentice follows one character's point of view, this young boy, this bastard. You meet him when he's 5 years old, and this whole first book is the early part of his life. And so you only see things from his point of view. And so because of that, there's all these things happening in the background, many of the same political intrigue and the backstabbing and the magic and the treaties and all of these kind of exciting things that are happening in A Game of Thrones. Parallel versions of them are happening in Assassin's Apprentice, but we don't see them because we see the world from this one character's point of view. And so we get deeper into his reality and we understand the world from his perspective as opposed to jumping around. And that has tremendous bearing on how you experience the story. And I think that's part of the reason people complain that this book is slow going, right? Is because you are with this one character and he doesn't live the most exciting life all the time. And so because of that, you have to take your time with this series. And so reading this book, it just got me thinking about how the same story can be told in different ways to drastically different effect. Because, you know, this story could be told from multiple point of view. There are a number of characters who I'd love to spend more time with, and we could jump around, you know, I could think easily of a half dozen characters who could have point of view chapters, and you could jump around all of them. And it would be just as dynamic and as compelling and as frenetic as A Game of Thrones. And yet, Hobb chooses not to do that. She chooses to take it slow. She chooses to focus on this one story, and everything blossoms out of this one story and out of these experiences of this one person. And, you know, one type of storytelling isn't better than the other. They're just different ways to tell a story. And so I've been thinking a lot just about style and about how something is presented and the way it is presented, how that affects the experience of reading it or of participating in some sort of relationship with it. Another thing that got me thinking about this was, as I mentioned, I read Absolution, which is the fourth book in the Southern Reach trilogy. And, you know, the Southern Reach trilogy jumps around in the way Vandermeer tells stories. The first book is told in first person through basically a series of journal entries. The second book takes place chronologically immediately after the events of the first book. And that one is told from a close third person and with these kind of political thriller vibes. The third book in the series has multiple POV characters, and you jump back and forth in time, and you jump in and out of Area X, the supernatural area of the Forgotten Coast, where all these kind of things are happening. And so that one has this frenetic pace because not only are you seeing different perspectives, but you're not going in linear time. You're going all around the place. And now with the new one, it has 3 distinct sections. And the first section takes place 20 years before the boundary of Area X is formed. And then the next one takes place 18 months before the boundary. And then the last section takes place 1 year after the boundary, following the first expedition of scientists who go in to examine Area X. So technically, each section of this book falls before the first book in the Southern Reach trilogy. And now when I read it, that didn't even occur to me, right? Insofar as Vandermeer plays with time and space, and he's interested in exploring how time works and how we are destined to repeat ourselves as we try to fight against the transformations that are endemic or natural to the experience of being an embodied person. Yet, I listened to the New York Times Review of Books podcast, and they mentioned this book as coming out in October, and they talk about it as if it were a prequel to the Southern X trilogy. That's how they label it, as a prequel to the series. And they're not wrong. All the events of this book do take place before any of the other 3 books. So in that way, I suppose it's a prequel. But when you think about the way Vandermeer plays with time, it doesn't feel to me like it's a useful way to frame the story, because he's not interested in linear or chronological time as having any sort of significance in his ability to bring you to a place and tell a story to you about these people and about what's going on in this space. And I don't know, when something is labeled a prequel, it just gives you an impression of how that relates to the existing stories or to the existing trilogy. And it feels like it pulls it apart from the existing trilogy. And I know that as I was reading it, obviously I was well aware that it all took place before the events of the other stories, but never in my mind did I think of it as a prequel, especially because Vandermeer just plays with style and with chronology and with the idea of linear or circular time in such ways that are profound and noted in his books. And so hearing it mentioned as a prequel just got me thinking again, the way you package something and the way you sell something and the way something is presented to you can drastically affect your experience of it. So, I don't have any insight about this, but it's just something I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks as I read, as I've been reading a number of different books, is that how our presentation of a story, whether it be the presentation within the story, the narrative style, or the way the story itself is marketed and sold, can affect the way that we engage with it. And thinking about that, it's made me more conscious, just when I engage in a story, to pay attention to why is it being told the way it's being told? Why is a particular style being used? What is gained and what is lost by the author choosing a specific way both to tell a story as well as to market a story? When you read the jacket copy of a book, to be fair, that isn't always the author. It's often the marketing team or the publishing team. But when you read the jacket copy of a book and then you compare it to your experience of what actually happens when you read the book, does it feel like it's doing a good job of enticing you to the book and actually giving you a hint of what is going on? Or is there like a bait and switch happening, And what is the utility of that? Does that keep the book exciting, or does it make you feel like something was taken away from you? I don't have any answers, and I don't have any intent to kind of go on at length about it. It's just something I was thinking about, how style works and how dramatically you can change the experience of a story just by the way you present it, and how sometimes the form of a thing has a strong impact on the function of a thing in that way. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Are there different styles that when you pick up a book and you find it's written in a certain style that you're immediately attracted to it or maybe immediately repelled to it? I'd love to hear your experiences about thinking about style and form and function and how they all work together in the experience of enjoying art as well as marketing and selling art. So please share your thoughts, your ideas, your experiences down in the comments. But for now, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.